October 1946, Boyle Heights, Los Angeles. William Bruce is 24 years old. He's at the Sears store with his wife and her parents, shopping for a lawnmower. Then he sees a face. He knows that face. He knows it the way you know a scar. Bruce had been a prisoner of war in Japan. He'd survived Corregidor. He'd survived the Bataan Death March. He'd been packed into the hold of a hellship and transported to Japan. He'd spent 3 years in captivity. And in his last camp, near the Oyama nickel mine, the prisoners gave one particular man a nickname. They called him the Meatball. But here's the thing that stopped Bruce cold. The man wasn't a Japanese soldier who'd somehow slipped into the country. He was born in California. He carried an American passport. He was enrolled at the University of Southern California. His name was Tomoya Kawakita, and he was standing in a department store in Los Angeles, shopping like nothing had ever happened. Bruce didn't swing. He didn't shout. He didn't grab the man by the collar, though years later he admitted he wanted to. He followed Kawakita out to the parking lot, wrote down his license plate number, walked to a phone, and called the FBI. That's how an American soldier answered. But Kawakita was only one name in a much larger reckoning. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the United States faced a question no nation had ever confronted at this scale. Across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Burma, from Borneo to the Japanese home islands, thousands of men had spent nearly 4 years running prison camps where Allied servicemen were starved, beaten, and worked to the edge of death. Camp commandants, guards, interpreters, medical officers, civilian overseers. The question was simple to ask, and almost impossible to answer. What do you do with all of them? If this story matters to you, if you believe the men who endured those camps deserve to be remembered, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because someone should. The guards didn't exist in isolation. They were part of a system, and the system was enormous. During the war, Japan captured roughly 350,000 prisoners of war across Asia and the Pacific. About 132,000 of those prisoners came from Western Allied nations, the United States, the British Commonwealth, the Netherlands, Australia. More than 35,000 of them didn't survive. That's a death rate of 27%. 1 out of every 4 men taken prisoner by Japan never came home. The finding comes from the post-war Tokyo Tribunal, and it's been confirmed by every major study since in German and Italian prisoner of war camps. The death rate for Western Allied prisoners was 4%. The Japanese camps were 7 times worse. For American prisoners specifically, the numbers were even grimmer. Historian David M. Kennedy has documented that 90% of American POWs in the Pacific reported being beaten during captivity. More than a third did not survive. Those who did average 38 months in captivity, more than 3 years. The men who survived were not simply held. They were put to work. Coal mines in Kyushu, shipyards in Osaka, munitions factories across Honshu, nickel refineries on the west coast, copper mines in the north, and across Southeast Asia. Prisoners were pressed into the construction projects that powered Japan's war machine. The most notorious was the Burma-Thailand Railway. More than 60,000 Allied prisoners laid track through jungle and over mountains, working from dawn past dusk, 7 days a week, on starvation rations. Over 12,000 of them died doing it. The railway earned its name, the Death Railway. But the camps weren't just run by Japanese soldiers. Here's something most Americans have never heard. Japan ran a colonial empire. Korea had been a Japanese possession since 1910. Taiwan since 1895. Young men from both territories were conscripted into Japanese military service, not as equals, but as subordinates. Thousands were assigned to guard duty at prisoner of war camps. It was considered the lowest, least desirable work in the Imperial Army. These colonial guards occupied a vicious middle position. Japanese officers treated them with open contempt, beat them, humiliated them, considered them inferior. And the guards, in turn, passed that violence downward onto the prisoners. They were caught between 2 worlds of brutality, belonging to neither, answerable to both. After the war, when the Allies held war crimes trials, these colonial guards bore a disproportionate weight. 148 Koreans were convicted as war criminals. 23 were executed. 173 Taiwanese were convicted. 26 were executed. Most of them had been low-ranking camp guards. Many were young men when they were conscripted. Some had never heard of the Geneva Convention before they were put on trial for violating it. One Taiwanese guard, named K, later said that his indictment shocked him. He didn't even know such international regulations existed. When the war ended, there was still another problem. As Japan surrendered, the Japanese military moved quickly to destroy its records. Across the Pacific, camp commanders burned prisoner rosters, death certificates, medical logs, supply records, anything that documented what had happened inside the wire. The destruction was systematic and thorough. When Allied forces arrived at camp after camp, they found the filing cabinets empty. In many cases, the Allies didn't even know how many prisoners had been held at a given location, or how many had died there. They didn't have a complete list of camps. They didn't have a full count of prisoners. The paper trail had been incinerated on purpose, which meant that if there was going to be any accounting at all, any justice, any record, it would have to come from the only source left: the memories of the men who survived. On December 6, 1945, less than 4 months after Japan's formal surrender, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger received his orders. Eichelberger was the commanding general of the WWII, 8th Army, headquartered in Yokohama. The directive came from General MacArthur's Supreme Command for the Allied powers: stand up military commissions, begin the trials. The Supreme Command had already been at work. Investigators had compiled dossiers on more than 2,000 suspects. War crimes investigation detachments had fanned out across Japan and the Pacific, gathering evidence wherever it could still be found, which, given the scale of Japan's record destruction, was not many places. What followed was the largest American-led war crimes prosecution in the Pacific Theater. 372 cases were initiated. Of those, 319 reached the trial stage. They were heard between February 1946 and October 1949, 3.5 years of proceedings, conducted by military commissions appointed by the 8th Army. 996 men and women stood as defendants. 854 were convicted. 124 received death sentences. 51 of those sentences were carried out at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. The last executions took place on April 7, 1950. 63 were sentenced to life imprisonment. 667 received fixed prison terms, often accompanied by hard labor. 142 were acquitted outright. These 319 trials at Yokohama accounted for the majority of all 474 war crimes cases the United States prosecuted across the Asia-Pacific region. And the great majority of those defendants were connected to one thing above all: the treatment of Allied prisoners of war. But what made the Yokohama trials unusual, what set them apart from both Nuremberg and the Tokyo Tribunal, was the breadth of the defendants. This was not a prosecution of generals and politicians. At Yokohama, the men and women in the dock came from every rung of the Japanese wartime structure. Professional military officers, from generals down to privates, interpreters, farmers who'd been drafted into camp service, Shinto priests, college professors, mine foremen, doctors, nurses. A former army nurse named Shigeko Tsutsui was charged for her role in unauthorized medical procedures performed on captured American airmen. Lieutenant General Tasuku Okada was convicted of ordering the summary execution of 38 American aircrews who'd been shot down and captured. He was hanged in 1949. At Naoetsu, officially designated Tokyo Prisoner of War Camp No. 4, conditions had been so extreme and prisoner deaths so numerous that 8 guards were sentenced to death by hanging. At Hiraoka, also known as Mitsushima, Tokyo No. 12, 6 guards received the same sentence. Camp by camp, guard by guard, name by name. The commissions worked through the cases. Each trial produced a review, a written record of the charges, the evidence, the defense, the verdict, and the legal reasoning behind the sentence. These reviews were examined by the Judge Advocate General's Office of the Eighth Army to check for legal errors. Every death sentence required confirmation at the highest levels before it could be carried out. It was methodical. It was deliberate. And it took 3.5 years. But every prosecutor in Yokohama faced the same fundamental problem. With the camp records destroyed, the cases had to be built on something that couldn't be burned: the sworn statements of the men who'd lived through it. Hundreds of former prisoners of war, American, British, Australian, Dutch, wrote detailed affidavits describing what had been done to them. They named names. They described incidents. They placed specific guards at specific camps on specific dates. They did this from memory, because there were no surviving camp records to confirm or contradict them. Many of those affidavits were taken after the men had already been repatriated and sent home. There was no cross-examination, no face-to-face confrontation between the witness and the accused. The sworn statement stood on its own. Defense attorneys challenged this. They argued the identifications were unreliable, that years of malnutrition and trauma had distorted the witnesses' memories, that the wrong men were being blamed. Some of those objections had merit. Some defendants were acquitted for lack of firm evidence. The system wasn't perfect, but it was the only system available, and it existed because the people who should have preserved the evidence chose to destroy it instead. I think there's something worth sitting with in that fact. The men who burned the records created the very conditions that forced the trials to rely on memory. They built the terms of their own prosecution. Now, back to the man in the Sears store. Tomoya Kawakita was born in Calexico, California, on September 26, 1921. His parents were Japanese immigrants, his father a grocer and merchant. By the law of the land, Kawakita was an American citizen at birth. By Japanese law, he was also a Japanese national through his parents. In 1939, after graduating high school in Calexico, Kawakita traveled to Japan with his father to visit his grandfather. His father returned to the United States. The 18-year-old Kawakita stayed behind to continue his education, enrolling first in a preparatory school for Nisei students, then at Meiji University in Tokyo. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and Kawakita was trapped. He couldn't get home. He was an American-born man, stranded in a country now at war with his own. Over the next 2 years, he completed his degree, and in 1943, he registered in his family's Koseki, the Japanese household registry, formally claiming Japanese nationality. A family friend named Takeo Miki helped him find work. Miki connected Kawakita with a job as an interpreter at the Nippon Yakan nickel refinery in Oyama, on the western coast of Honshu. The refinery processed metals for Japan's war industry, and about 7.5 miles from the factory, there was a prisoner of war camp, later designated Osaka Camp 3B. At first, the camp held British and Canadian prisoners of war who worked the surface mines. Then, in August 1944, 400 American POWs arrived. Many of them had been captured at Corregidor and Bataan in 1942. They had already endured more than 2 years of Japanese captivity. They arrived weakened, underfed, and worn down to bone. Kawakita's job was to interpret, to relay orders from Japanese supervisors to the English-speaking prisoners. He held no military rank. He carried no weapon. On paper, he was a civilian employee of a private mining company. But the American prisoners didn't remember him as just a translator. They remembered a man who went out of his way to add his own insults when delivering commands, who carried himself with an authority he didn't have, who used his position as the go-between to intimidate men who couldn't fight back, who seemed to take genuine satisfaction in watching Americans humiliated in front of their Japanese captors. They remembered him saying that America had never given him a damn thing. The prisoners called him the meatball. Now, there were 3 Nisei interpreters at Camp Oyama. All 3 were in the same impossible situation, American-born men of Japanese descent, caught in Japan during the war, working at a camp that held their own countrymen. One of them was a man named Meiji Fujisawa. Fujisawa had grown up with Kawakita. They were childhood friends. But when the war ended, the American prisoners treated Fujisawa completely differently. Former POWs told investigators that Fujisawa had done the best he could to help them, that he'd tried to get them medicine when they were sick. The Americans didn't just decline to accuse Fujisawa, they actively spoke up in his defense. Fujisawa was never prosecuted, not because the system overlooked him, but because the men he'd guarded refused to condemn him. Same war, same camp, same job, same dual identity. Two men, two choices. After Japan's surrender, Kawakita's behavior changed overnight. He cooperated with American forces, served as their interpreter at Oyama for several months. Then he made his way to the U.S. consulate in Yokohama and applied for a passport renewal, swearing under oath that he was an American citizen and had never renounced his citizenship. The consulate officer didn't find his story unusual. Many Nisei were doing the same thing, trying to leave war-ravaged Japan. The 8th Army's Counterintelligence Corps records showed nothing of concern. Kawakita received a new passport and sailed home in 1946. By October, he was a student at USC, walking across a campus full of returning veterans. He didn't hide. He didn't change his name. He enrolled under his real identity at a university loaded with former GIs. That's where William Bruce found him. Bruce was a survivor of Corregidor, the Death March, a hell ship, and 3 years of captivity. On an afternoon in October, shopping for a lawnmower with his young wife and her parents, he looked across the floor of a department store and locked eyes with the man who had made his life a living hell. He followed Kawakita to the parking lot, took down the plate number, called the FBI. Federal agents spent 8 months building the case. They tracked down veterans from Oyama across the country. On June 5, 1947, Kawakita was arrested and charged with 13 counts of treason. Not war crimes, treason, because Tomoya Kawakita was an American citizen, and under the United States Constitution, an American citizen who gives aid and comfort to the enemy during wartime commits the oldest crime in the Republic. Each of the 13 counts carried the possibility of death. His defense attorney, Morris Levine, argued that Kawakita had perceived himself as a Japanese citizen during the war, that he was nothing more than a messenger, translating orders he had no power to change, that the real abusers were the Japanese officers. Kawakita was simply the voice. The lead prosecutor, James Carter, told the jury that Kawakita had treated his American citizenship like a faucet, turning it off when Japan was winning, turning it back on the moment Japan lost. Close to 100 former POWs volunteered to travel to Los Angeles and testify against him. The jury, 3 men and 9 women, deliberated for 8 days. Multiple times they reported to Judge William Mathis that they were hopelessly deadlocked. Each time, the judge sent them back. On September 2, 1948, 3 years to the day after Japan's formal surrender, they returned a verdict. Guilty on 8 of 13 counts. The sentence, death. When Judge Mathis spoke before sentencing, he didn't dwell on the abuse at Oyama. He talked about something larger. He invoked the name of Sadao Munamori, a Japanese-American soldier who had dived onto a grenade to save 2 of his comrades and received the Medal of Honor. He spoke of nearly 700 other Nisei men who had given their lives fighting for the United States, many of them with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Same ancestry, same blood, same war. Some chose to fight for their country. One chose to betray it. The case went to the United States Supreme Court. In June 1952, the justices upheld the conviction. The ruling established a principle that stands to this day. An American citizen owes allegiance to the United States regardless of dual nationality or where they reside. President Eisenhower commuted the death sentence to life in prison. Kawakita was transferred to Alcatraz, then later to other federal facilities. In 1963, President Kennedy pardoned Kawakita on one condition. He would be deported to Japan and could never set foot on American soil again. He lived out his remaining years there. The family friend who had helped him find work at the nickel refinery all those years ago, Takeo Miki, went on to become Prime Minister of Japan. While the Yokohama trials were still underway, the ground shifted beneath them. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communist forces won the Chinese Civil War. In June 1950, North Korea invaded the South, and American soldiers were fighting and dying on the Asian mainland again. The strategic calculus flipped overnight. The United States no longer needed Japan as a penitent, defeated nation paying for its wartime sins. It needed Japan as a partner, a base of operations, a functioning democracy strong enough to resist communist pressure and willing to stand with the West. A weak Japan, vulnerable to Soviet or Chinese influence, was now a far greater threat than the war criminals still sitting in Sugamo prison. The policy reversed. In 1950, a parole system was established for Sugamo's inmates, and the first releases began. On April 28, 1952, the San Francisco Peace Treaty took effect, formally ending the American occupation and restoring Japanese sovereignty. Administrative control of Sugamo prison passed to Japan's Ministry of Justice. But Article 11 of the treaty included a catch. The countries that had originally prosecuted the war criminals retained the right to approve or deny any release. Releases required unanimous consent from the former allies. In practice, that consent came easier and easier. By 1953, more than 800 convicted war criminals remained at Sugamo, and they weren't quiet about it. Inside the prison, inmates organized petitions and published newsletters. Outside, their families and supporters launched a public campaign, casting the prisoners not as convicted criminals, but as martyrs, loyal soldiers punished by foreign victors for doing their duty. The movement gained broad public sympathy across Japan. Millions of Japanese signed petitions calling for their release. Meanwhile, inside the U.S. State Department, American officials were coming to the same conclusion from the opposite direction. Internal cables from 1954 stated it plainly. The continued imprisonment of Japanese war criminals was, in their words, hardly consistent with American policies of treating Japan as a sovereign and responsible ally. It was creating friction. It was undermining cooperation on defense issues at precisely the moment the United States needed that cooperation most. The process was not without resistance. Some within the American government believed the sentences should stand, but the political current was running the other way, and by mid-decade, the pace of releases had quickened sharply. The releases accelerated through the mid-1950s. On May 31, 1958, the last 18 war criminals still at Sugamo were paroled. The prison was later demolished. A shopping complex and a park stand on the site today in Tokyo's Toshima ward. A small stone marker is all that remains. Some of the men who walked out of Sugamo disappeared into private life. Others walked straight back into power. Kishi Nobusuke had been held at Sugamo as a suspected Class A war criminal, one of Japan's wartime leaders accused of crimes against peace. He was never charged, never tried. He was released without prosecution in 1948, during a period American historians call the reverse course. 9 years later, in 1957, he became Prime Minister of Japan. His grandson, Shinzo Abe, later served as Prime Minister as well. Shigemitsu Mamoru had been convicted at the Tokyo Tribunal and sentenced to 7 years. He was paroled in 1950. He went on to serve as Japan's Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. Kaya Okinori had been convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was paroled in 1955. He became Japan's Minister of Justice, the top law enforcement official in the country. And in 1978, in a decision that was kept quiet at the time, the souls of 14 Class A war criminals, including former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, and 6 others who had been executed, were enshrined at Yasukuni, Japan's national memorial to its war dead. The men who had been convicted of crimes against peace, men who helped lead Japan into a war that killed millions, were now honored in the same shrine as the ordinary soldiers who had died fighting it. After the war, Something unexpected began happening across Japan. In towns where prisoner of war camps had once stood, some Japanese civilians began building memorials, not for Japanese soldiers, for the Allied prisoners who had died there. At Ofuna, a Buddhist monk from a temple near the former camp erected a stone marker on his own initiative. No government ordered it. No international body requested it. A monk decided it was the right thing to do. At Naoetsu, one of the camps that had produced the harshest sentences, local Japanese residents quietly took responsibility for the prisoners' graves. They maintained the burial sites for decades. They held memorial ceremonies year after year. They laid flowers and kept the grounds clean, long after most of the world had forgotten the camp ever existed. One of those residents was a man named Ishizuka Shoichi. He had been a Japanese soldier during the war. After Japan's surrender, he was captured and held as a prisoner by the Allies. He later described his own experience as a POW as being like paradise. Then he learned what Allied prisoners had endured at Naoetsu, the camp in his own town. The contrast stunned him. He spent years working to make sure the camp was remembered. He helped build monuments. He welcomed former Australian POWs and their families when they traveled to Japan to see the place where their fathers and grandfathers had suffered. Those memorials still stand. The trial records from Yokohama, more than 300 cases, comprising thousands of pages, are preserved at the National Archives in Washington. And the sworn statements written by the men who survived those camps are still in the files. Every name the survivors could recall, every incident they could describe, every guard they could identify. Some guards were hanged. Some were sentenced to life. And then, for reasons that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with geography and politics, most of them were released. But the testimony remains. Sworn, signed, on the record, filed in the archives of the country those men fought for. No one can parole a sworn statement, and no treaty can grant clemency to the truth. If your father or grandfather was a prisoner of war in the Pacific, we'd like to hear their story. Share it in the comments. These men carried what happened to them for the rest of their lives. The least we can do is make sure someone is still listening. Shikoku, Japan, February 1993. A man lies in a nursing home bed. No visitors. No flowers. Outside the window, rain. He stares at the ceiling. He has been staring at ceilings for a long time now. He is 80 years old. He has a gas station that barely breaks even. He has a wife who sells insurance so they can eat. He has a memoir that nobody outside Japan has read. And he has a secret he carried for 52 years before anyone thought to ask him about it. Because 52 years ago, this man knew Pearl Harbor better than any admiral the United States Navy had stationed there. He knew which ships were moored and where. He knew which day of the week the fleet was fullest in port. He knew which runways could launch 3 aircraft simultaneously. He knew the depth of the water at every point in the harbor. He was not an admiral. He never fired a weapon in his life. He bought a tourist boat ticket. And he looked down through the glass bottom. And he remembered everything he saw. His name was Takeo Yoshikawa. And before this video is over, you may find yourself sitting with a feeling you didn't expect. Not anger, not sympathy. Something harder to name than either of those. If stories like this one matter to you, hit that like button right now. Not for the number, because that's the only way this channel stays alive. And it's the only way these stories find the people who need to hear them. Because what I'm about to tell you doesn't start at Pearl Harbor. It starts in a small room in Japan, 10 years earlier, with a young man who had just been told by a Navy doctor that his life, the life he had planned, was over. Kasumigaura Naval Air Station, Japan, late 1934. Yoshikawa climbed into the cockpit. He didn't know it would be the last time, not because he flew badly, not because he froze. That morning, a military physician pressed a stethoscope to his chest, listened, and wrote 2 words into a file folder. Yoshikawa wasn't allowed to read what those words said, but he saw the doctor's face when he wrote them, and he understood. He took the paper back to his quarters, read it once, set it down on the desk. Then he sat there. He didn't telephone home. He didn't write a letter. What he wrote, later, in a diary that survived him, was that he no longer knew who he was. To understand what that cost him, you have to understand what Japan was in 1934. Not the Japan of 1946, rebuilding from rubble. Not the Japan of today. The Japan of 1934 was a cut out the window too. He counted the runways at Wheeler Field. He counted the hangars at Hickam. He felt the wind at altitude, the direction, the strength, how it shifted over the ridgeline. Information about those air currents would eventually find its way into the flight briefings for the pilots who launched from Japanese carriers before dawn on December 7th. Those pilots never knew who had flown the same air before them. There was one thing Tokyo still needed: the anti-submarine barriers at the entrance to Pearl Harbor, their depth, their configuration, whether a torpedo could pass underneath them. Yoshikawa went to the beach at Mamala on a dark night in the fall. He waded in. He dove under, using a hollow reed as a breathing tube. No gear, no tank. Nothing that would look out of place if anyone happened to be watching the shoreline. The water was cold. The current pushed him around. He came up without what he needed. The next morning, he sent Tokyo a 2-word telegram. Details unclear. That was the only time, in 9 months of work, that he sent a message like that. Through all of it, the boats, the tea house, the flights, the beach at night, his colleagues believed he was the laziest diplomat they had ever worked with. He disappeared for hours at a time. They shook their heads and kept working. The FBI had a file on the Honolulu consulate. They had a name in that file: Tadashi Morimura, vice consul, young, moved around a lot. That was the whole file. The man they were actually looking for, Japan's only military intelligence agent in Hawaii, was renting glass-bottom boats and drinking sake on a hillside with his hands in plain view. No code books, no dead drops, no radio equipment hidden in the walls, just a memory that held everything it was given, and eyes that knew exactly what to look for. Saturday, December 6th, 1941. Honolulu. Evening. On Battleship Row, the USS Arizona rode at anchor in berth F7. She had been there all week. On the mess decks, a group of men were playing cards. Someone was losing badly and letting everyone know about it. In the galley, the cooks were already prepping Sunday breakfast. Scrambled eggs, biscuits, the kind of morning meal you put together when there's nothing much on the schedule. Men were writing letters home. Some of them to mothers in Ohio and Georgia and Oregon. Some of them to wives they had married the year before. Some of them to fathers who had served in the last war and wanted to know what it was like over there. Men were reading, sleeping. The ship sat low in the water, heavy and still. The harbor was quiet. Music came from somewhere across the water. Someone's radio turned up too loud, the notes carrying flat and thin across the dark. Nobody on that ship was thinking about the morning. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that in an intelligence file in Tokyo, the USS Arizona's exact position had been mapped and recorded months earlier. Berth F7, Battleship Row. The man who had put it there was sitting on a hillside 7 miles away. On Aloha Heights, Yoshikawa sat at the window of the Shuncho row. Below him, the lights of Pearl Harbor spread across the dark water. He didn't use the telescope that night. He didn't need to. In the summer, a Japanese intelligence officer had come through Honolulu disguised as a steward on a commercial ocean liner. He carried a list. 97 questions about Pearl Harbor, depth of the harbor entrance channel, position of the fuel storage tanks, the patrol schedule of the aircraft based at Wheeler and Hickam, whether the fleet was ever fully in port at the same time, and if so, which day of the week. Sunday, Yoshikawa had written back. He had answered all 97. His work was done. He poured another drink and looked at the lights below. At 1:20 in the morning of December 7th, far out at sea, aboard the Japanese fleet carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichai was handed a telegram. He read it by the light on the bridge. Vessels moored in harbor, 9 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 3 seaplane tenders, 17 destroyers. All aircraft carriers and heavy cruisers have departed harbor. No indication of any changes in fleet alert status or anything unusual. That was the last message Takeo Yoshikawa ever sent. Nagumo set the paper down, gave the order. 353 aircraft began moving to the flight decks. Yoshikawa didn't know his telegram was being read on the Akagi. Nagumo didn't know the name of the man who wrote it. The men on the Arizona didn't know either of those men existed. 3 men, 1 harbor, 1 night. By morning, only 2 of those 3 facts would still be true. 7:55 a.m., December 7th, 1941. The first wave came from the north. 183 aircraft. The pilots who flew that morning had been trained for months on attack routes, and approach angles developed from intelligence reports. Reports about where the ships were, which runways were operational, where the fuel lines ran. Reports written by a man who had watched all of it through a borrowed telescope from a hillside in the dark. The USS Arizona took a bomb between her 2 forward gun turrets. It punched through the deck and detonated the forward ammunition magazine. The explosion shook buildings across Honolulu. Men on ships across the harbor felt it before they heard it. A pressure wave through the hull, through the deck plates, through the soles of their feet. Then the sound. Then the column of black smoke, rising so fast and so thick it blotted out the sky above Ford Island. 1,177 men died in under 9 minutes. The men writing letters home the night before. The men playing cards. The men sleeping. The ship sank in 40 feet of water. She is still there. Yoshikawa was standing at a consulate window when the smoke began rising from Pearl Harbor. 7 miles. Black columns. The sound reached him a few seconds after the light. There is no written record of what he thought in those minutes at the window. No diary entry. No account from anyone standing near him. He watched. That's all we know. But here is what Yoshikawa did not know that morning, and what I need you to sit with for a moment. His final telegram had contained 1 line that would change the outcome of the entire war. All aircraft carriers and heavy cruisers have departed harbor. He had reported it as a routine observation, the kind of detail he noted every time the fleet shifted. USS Enterprise was ferrying aircraft to Wake Island. USS Lexington was delivering planes toward Midway Atoll. USS Saratoga was undergoing repairs on the west coast. Nagumo read that line, confirmed the carriers were not in port, and chose not to send a search mission. The attack would proceed as planned. The carriers could be dealt with later. There was no later. Lexington was lost at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, before Midway was ever fought. Saratoga arrived at Pearl Harbor on June 6, 1942, the day after the battle at Midway ended. She missed it by 1 day, but Enterprise survived. And at Midway, in June 1942, Enterprise and 2 other carriers, Hornet and the damaged Yorktown, patched together in 72 hours at Pearl Harbor, met the Japanese fleet. In a single afternoon, on June 4th, 1942, American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, gone. The Japanese Navy never recovered. The momentum of the entire Pacific War shifted in the space of a single morning. Now, if your father served in the Pacific, if he came home, if you grew up knowing his face across the dinner table, think about what the road home looked like. Midway, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima. The Long Island hopping campaign that ground its way back toward Japan, one bloody beach at a time. None of it unfolds the same way if those carriers are sitting in Pearl Harbor on December 7th. None of it. The man who reported them gone, who wrote that single line as a plain Saturday night fact, was standing at a consulate window 7 miles away, watching the smoke rise, and had no idea what that line had just preserved. He never knew. He went to his grave, not knowing that a piece of paper he filled out on a Saturday night may have been part of the reason someone you love came home. Take a moment with that. Because I don't know how to tell you where to put that feeling. I'm not sure there is a place for it. A few hours after the attack began, American soldiers arrived at the Japanese consulate and placed everyone inside under guard. Yoshikawa sat in a room and answered questions. Name, Tadashi Morimura. Title, Vice Consul. Anything unusual about his activities? No. J. Edgar Hoover wanted to prosecute. He knew there had been a Japanese agent in Honolulu. The State Department said no. Prosecution would put American consular staff overseas at risk. They would let the diplomatic staff go. In February 1942, Yoshikawa and 22 other consulate employees were transferred to a remote guest ranch in Arizona, the Triangle T Ranch, guarded by Border Patrol agents who had no idea who they were watching. The FBI questioned them for weeks. They were looking for Tadashi Morimura. He answered every question, politely, in English. They wrote in his file, nothing of note. He was repatriated through a prisoner exchange. He stepped off the ship in Yokohama still carrying a passport in someone else's name. The name Takeo Yoshikawa does not appear once in the 10 million words of the Joint Congressional Committee report on the attack on Pearl Harbor, published in 1946. Not once. Back in Tokyo, he returned to work for naval intelligence. His mission remained classified. The people he lived with did not know what he had done. He said nothing. Japan surrendered in August 1945. Yoshikawa didn't wait to see what happened next. He moved into a Zen Buddhist temple on Shikoku and didn't come out for 4 years. No name. The paper back to his quarters. Read it once. Set it down on the desk. Then he sat there. He didn't telephone home. He didn't write a letter. What he wrote, later, in a diary that survived him, was that he no longer knew who he was. To understand what that cost him, you have to understand what Japan was in 1934, not the Japan of 1946, rebuilding from rubble, not the Japan of today. The Japan of 1934 was a country that told its young men exactly one thing. Your worth is measured by what you are willing to sacrifice. Yoshikawa was born in Matsuyama, on the island of Shikoku. His father was a policeman, not a general, not a merchant, a local policeman in a provincial town, the kind of man who stood at attention when officers walked past. For a boy from that family, in that country, in that year, becoming a naval aviator wasn't just ambition. It was the only way to become someone his father could hold his head up about. He passed the entrance exams for the Naval Academy at Itajima, graduated in 1933, 92nd out of 116 men. He got in. He got through. He was assigned to the armored cruiser Asama, then to submarines, then finally to flight training. He was 22 years old. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. And then, the stomach. The illness came on gradually, then didn't leave. He went home to recover in 1935. The Navy kept his file open. He kept waiting for the call to come back. It came in 1936, not the call he was waiting for. The Navy told him he was medically unfit to continue active service. He was discharged, at the rank of ensign, after 3 years. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, there was no graceful way to absorb that. He later wrote that he thought about ending his life. He was 24 years old, discharged from the only institution that had given him a sense of purpose, trying to figure out what a man does when the door he spent his whole life walking toward is quietly, permanently, closed. A year passed. Then, in 1937, an envelope arrived. Naval General Staff Headquarters, Tokyo. Inside, a transfer order. Intelligence Division, U.S. Navy and United Kingdom Section. No explanation. No choice. He reported for duty. What followed was 4 years in a room with no window. A room. No window. Tokyo. Every morning, he sat down at a desk and read. Jane's Fighting Ships, the British Naval Almanac that listed every warship in every fleet in the world, right down to displacement tonnage and gun caliber. The Congressional Record, the published proceedings of the United States Congress, available to anyone who wanted to order it, full of budget debates where American senators talked openly about how many ships they were building and where they were going. Travel brochures for Hawaii, steamship schedules from San Francisco to Honolulu, newspaper clippings, radio transcripts. Nobody told him why. He read everything. He memorized what he read. And after 4 years, he knew more about the layout of the United States Pacific Fleet than most of the men serving in it. In late 1940, his superior called him in and gave him a verbal briefing. Nothing was written down. The assignment, Go to Hawaii. Watch. Report. He was given a new name. Tadashi Morimura, a diplomat's passport, the title of vice consul. He left for Hawaii on March 27, 1941. In every war, there are men who didn't choose what they became. They only chose what to do after the first door closed, and the men at Pearl Harbor, painting their ships, writing letters home, eating breakfast on Sunday mornings, had no idea that a quiet young man with a diplomat's passport was already on his way to study them. March 27, 1941. The Japanese ocean liner Nita Maru eased into Pier 8 at Honolulu Harbor, alongside the Aloha Tower. One of the passengers who walked down the gangway that morning was a 29-year-old man of medium height, black hair combed straight back, civilian clothes, nothing about him that made you look twice. In his jacket pocket, a diplomatic passport in the name of Tadashi Morimura, Vice Consul, Japanese Consulate General, Honolulu. His real name appeared on no document in Hawaii. A consulate official walked him through customs, drove him to the 2-story building on Nuuanu Avenue. He met the Consul General, Nagao Kita, one of only 2 men in all of Honolulu who knew what Tadashi Morimura was actually there to do. He unpacked his bags, went to bed. In the morning, he stood at a second-floor window and looked west. 7 miles away, across the flat water of the coastal plain, he could see the silhouettes. Battleships. He couldn't read their hull numbers from that distance. He didn't need to. He could count them. He could tell which ones had moved overnight, which berths were full, which were empty. He stood at that window every morning before he walked to the consulate. Honolulu in the spring of 1941 was a city that did not know it was being watched. Navy officers walked the sidewalks in uniform without looking over their shoulders. The weather was warm. The restaurants were full on Friday nights. On weekends, the beaches at Waikiki were crowded with sailors on liberty. They talked about baseball, about the girls back home, about whether the United States was going to get dragged into the war in Europe. Nobody was talking about Japan. Not seriously. Not yet. His colleagues at the consulate thought he was lazy, always disappearing after lunch, not coming back until the following day. They assumed he was sleeping somewhere, seeing someone. The things young men do when their afternoons are their own. No one asked him where he went. 2 weeks after he arrived, Yoshikawa composed his first telegram to Tokyo. Tokyo responded immediately, and from that point forward, twice a week, as regular as the mail, he sent his reports. Each one encrypted, each one transmitted from the consulate's code room, each one received in Tokyo, decoded, and passed up the chain. The rhythm of it settled in quickly. Window in the morning, into the city by afternoon, back to his quarters after dark. Write what he had seen, encode it, send it, week after week, through spring, through summer, into fall. What Yoshikawa didn't know was that the Americans were reading some of his messages. U.S. military intelligence had broken the Japanese diplomatic code. In September 1941, a message came through that should have stopped everything cold. Tokyo was asking Morimura to divide Pearl Harbor into 5 distinct zones and report the location of warships in each zone separately. That is the kind of request you make when you are planning exactly where to send your bombs. The message was flagged, logged, marked low priority. It wasn't fully decoded until the middle of October. The analyst who read it didn't see anything worth escalating, just ship positions, routine stuff. He filed it and moved on. There were no gadgets, no hidden radio transmitters, no miniature cameras sewn into coat linings, no ciphered messages written in invisible ink. What Yoshikawa had was a good memory, a willingness to go anywhere that was technically open to the public, and enough patience to go back to the same places until he understood what he was looking at. Kaneohe Bay sits on the eastern side of Oahu, a wide, shallow bay that opens to the Pacific. The Navy had been talking about using it as an alternative anchorage for the fleet. Tokyo wanted to know if that was feasible. Yoshikawa bought a ticket for the glass-bottom boat tour. The boat moved slowly over the reef. The tour guide explained the coral formations, the species of fish, the history of the bay. Yoshikawa nodded along. He was watching the bottom, calculating depth, running the numbers, draft of a battleship, clearance from the reef at low tide. He made the trip several times, different sections of the bay each time. His conclusion: too shallow. The fleet couldn't use it. He reported that to Tokyo. Tokyo crossed Kaneohe Bay off the list. From that point on, there was only one target. The boat tours were only part of it. On the slopes of Aloha Heights, above the city, there was a Japanese tea house called the Shunshō-ro, the Spring Tide Restaurant. The proprietress was a woman named Taneo Fujiwara, from the same prefecture in Japan as Yoshikawa, Ehime, on the island of Shikoku. The tea house had sake. It had geishas. It had a second-floor window that looked directly down over Pearl Harbor, Ford Island, and Hickam Army Airfield. And it had a telescope. Yoshikawa became a regular. Most evenings he drank and made conversation, and behaved the way a young diplomat with too much free time would behave. But on certain nights, the nights he needed to work, he drank more than he usually did. Or appeared to. He let himself go slack. He let his eyes go heavy. And when the other guests started leaving, when the geishas said goodnight, when the proprietress began closer seas at risk, they would let the diplomatic staff go. In February 1942, Yoshikawa and 22 other consulate employees were transferred to a remote guest ranch in Arizona, the Triangle T Ranch, guarded by Border Patrol agents who had no idea who they were watching. The FBI questioned them for weeks. They were looking for Tadashi Morimura. He answered every question, politely, in English. They wrote in his file, nothing of note. He was repatriated through a prisoner exchange. He stepped off the ship in Yokohama still carrying a passport in someone else's name. The name Takeo Yoshikawa does not appear once in the 10 million words of the Joint Congressional Committee report on the attack on Pearl Harbor, published in 1946. Not once. Back in Tokyo, he returned to work for Naval Intelligence. His mission remained classified. The people he lived with did not know what he had done. He said nothing. Japan surrendered in August 1945. Yoshikawa didn't wait to see what happened next. He moved into a Zen Buddhist temple on Shikoku and didn't come out for 4 years. No name. No contact. He shaved his head. He wore monk's clothing. He sat in rooms where no one asked about the war because everyone in those rooms was trying to forget the same thing. The first time, he had hidden his name on orders from the Navy. This time, he hid it because he was afraid. The American occupation of Japan ended in 1952. He came back out slowly, returned to his wife, tried to figure out what a man does with a secret no one wants to hear. In 1955, he opened a small candy shop on Shikoku. Word got around. Neighbors stopped coming in. One man said it to his face. "You're the reason they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima." The shop closed within a few months. In 1961, CBS invited him to appear on a television program marking the 20th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. He said yes, he needed the money. In Japan, the reaction split cleanly down two lines. The nationalist right called him a traitor for cooperating with Americans. The anti-war left called him a war criminal for what he had done in the first place. The Japanese government said nothing. No pension, no formal recognition, no acknowledgement that he had ever served. He opened a gas station on Shikoku, the same island where he had hidden in Buddhist temples for 4 years after the war. Every morning, his wife set his coffee down in front of him before he asked. She had married him after the war, knowing only pieces of what he had done. Over the years, she had learned the rest. She never told anyone. She knew his name. She knew what he had done. And she was the only person in his life for whom those two things were connected, and neither one of them a source of shame. He told a reporter once, "My wife alone shows me great respect. Every day she bows to me. She knows I am a man of history." His wife sold insurance. He sat by the window with a glass in his hand and looked at nothing in particular. He wrote his memoirs in 1963, published in Japan. For 57 years, no one translated them into English. The English translation appeared in 2020. 27 years after he died. There is one more thing worth knowing. After Pearl Harbor, 120,000 Japanese Americans were removed from their homes and sent to internment camps. The government pointed to the existence of a Japanese spy in Honolulu as part of the justification. Yoshikawa wrote about this in his memoirs. He wrote that the Japanese-American community in Hawaii had never helped him, that when he approached them, the answer was always the same: I am an American. These were people born in Hawaii, who had gone to American schools, who had sons serving in the United States Army. They owed Yoshikawa nothing. They gave him nothing. And yet, after December 7th, their loyalty didn't matter. The people who lost their homes, their businesses, their property, had nothing to do with what Yoshikawa had done. He knew that. He wrote it down. He never said it publicly, while it might have mattered. History didn't know where to put him. He wasn't villain enough for a war crimes trial. He wasn't hero enough for a monument. He was a man who had done exactly what he was told to do, done it better than anyone else could have done it, and spent the rest of his life waiting for someone to say, "We know. We see what you did." It mattered. Nobody said it. Not the Navy he had served. Not the country he had given his career to. Not the government that had sent him to Hawaii with a false name and a diplomat's passport, and no plan whatsoever for what came after. He died on February 20th, 1993, in a nursing home on Shikoku, outside the window. Rain. I'm not telling you this story, so you'll feel sorry for him. I'm not asking you to forgive him for what his work made possible. September 2, 1945. Tokyo Bay. On the deck of the USS Missouri, the most powerful battleship the United States Navy had ever put to sea, Japanese officials in formal dress stepped forward to sign the document that ended the war. 70 million people had died. 6 years of fighting across 2 oceans, 5 continents, and more islands than most Americans could name. And it was over. Standing at the table, signing on behalf of the United States of America, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz. MacArthur ran the ceremony. Halsey stood nearby. Cameras rolled. History was recorded. Ernest King was not in the photograph. Not because he wasn't invited. Not because he lacked the standing. King was the only man in the entire war who held both top positions in the U.S. Navy simultaneously. Commander-in-Chief of the Fleet and Chief of Naval Operations. Nimitz reported to him. Halsey reported to him. Every admiral on the deck of the Missouri that morning reported to him. He wasn't there because he was the only man among those who truly won this war who understood, without needing anyone to tell him, that that moment was not his. Today, we tell the story of that man. The man Winston Churchill wanted Franklin Roosevelt to fire. The man Roosevelt wrote back to, in his own handwriting, on King's own letter. So what, old top? And the man that Nimitz, standing in the light on the deck of the Missouri, knew better than anyone, had made it all possible. December 1940. Ernest King took command of the Atlantic Patrol Force, the U.S. Navy's presence in the Atlantic Ocean at a time when the country was still officially at peace. The first thing he did was open the safe. Every incoming commander did this. Inside was the contingency plan, the document the Navy had prepared for the worst-case scenario, the one his predecessor had left behind for exactly this moment. King opened it, read it. Inside was a war plan for a conflict with Mexico. He closed the safe, didn't say a word about it to anyone. 3 days later, he issued an order placing his entire command on a war footing. No orders had come down from above. No one had asked him to. His country had not declared war on anyone. But in King's judgment, based on what he was seeing in the Atlantic, based on the German submarines already preying on British shipping, based on everything he had spent 30 years studying, the United States was already in a war. It just hadn't admitted it yet. His officers looked at each other. Nobody asked why. They had learned quickly that with this particular commander, it was better to keep quiet and move. Franklin Roosevelt once described King in a single sentence. He said King shaves every morning with a blowtorch. One of King's daughters, he had 6 children, was once asked about her father. She thought for a moment and answered, "He is the most even-tempered person in the United States Navy. He is always in a rage." It went back further than the Navy. When King was 7 years old, his mother scolded him at a dinner party for telling a guest, plainly, that he didn't like something she had served. The guest was sitting right there. His mother was mortified. King looked at his mother and said, "It's true. I don't like it." 50 years later, he was still that boy. As a 2-star admiral, King told his staff, "I don't care how good they are. Unless they get a kick in the ass every 6 weeks, they'll slack off." When a reporter asked him about the Navy's public relations policy during the war, King answered in one sentence, "Don't tell them anything. When it's over, tell them who won." The men who served under King long enough to understand him, most of them came to respect him in a way they didn't respect anyone else. But not one of them would have called him easy. Now, before we get to the war, before we get to the decisions that actually changed its outcome, you need to understand something about Ernest King that most histories skip over. Because if you don't understand what he had already done before 1941, you won't understand why Roosevelt called him when everything fell apart. Go back to September 1925. The submarine USS S-51 was running on the surface off Block Island, Rhode Island, on a routine training run. A merchant steamer came out of the dark and rammed her. S-51 went down in